So I'm working my way through some mailbag here, and this is an incoming question regarding miniature scale. This idea that we have numerous wargaming systems, and I'm just going to pull in a few examples from my own collection and some examples of war games that I enjoy playing. And then, of course, we'll kind of open up the feedback and you guys can map over some of the systems that you enjoy playing. I have the smaller scale, Chain of Command, Historicals, World War II, playing with a very, very small scale type figure, or DBA, DBN, Napoleonics, even a smaller scale. So really, really small scale miniatures. Then I've got games that are somewhat in the middle of scale. We look at something like Warhammer 40,000. Yes, there's some big models. There's a range, whether it's infantry, space marine, land raider, or a titan, but that's one particular scale, kind of that medium scale. I would lump Battletech in there. I mean, I know technically the mechs are bigger than a space marine, but we're talking right now about tabletop visual scale of the game. So I put that kind of in the medium. I put Wings of Glory in there also, maybe X-Wing miniatures. And then we have, I guess what they're billing now is heroic scale. This idea of slightly larger models. An example of the system that I enjoy playing. I'm waiting for Wave 2. We need Wave 2 immediately. I need some reinforcements to fight some more kaiju. Pacific Rim Extinction. That probably has the biggest overall scale of models in all of the systems that I play. And for me, when I think of scale, is it appropriate for the size of the engagement? That's kind of, now, obviously the bigger the scale, potentially the greater the detail, potentially the greater it'll paint. How it looks on the table could be better, maybe, than a smaller scale, but that's not always necessarily true, which again feeds into this idea, what is the scale of the engagement? And I'm going to kind of move into Warhammer 40,000 from this perspective. When we look at a war game, what is it looking to create? What level of engagement? Are we talking like Battle of Five Armies, massive, 500,000 combatants going at it? Are we talking kind of antiquities, Roman times, where you had massive legions? Or are we talking more kind of future war type, where it's squad-based, tactical, kind of a small group of commandos? Or, like in the case of Pacific Rim, 1-on-1, 2-on-1, 3-on-1, 3 or 4 models per side, very, very intimate type model-based. The scale, when it's off, is what kind of messes with things. So if we look at Warhammer 40,000, going back through all the different editions, if we look back to the earlier editions of 40K, we saw this with Rogue Trader. We saw this with Second. It started to shift in Third. If you look at the size of some of those armies, 40K was skirmish-based. It's almost like what Necromunda was, or Kill Teams, or Combat Patrol back in the day. This idea that, you might have a tank or a vehicle, you got 2 or 3 squads, and maybe you have a commander on the table. So the miniatures were keyed in to present that, because that could fit scaled on a gaming table. Bigger is always better in miniature size, because again, the detail, the presence, the way it takes paint, and we'll talk about that in a moment. That was the original scale. That was the original presentation. Now, over the years, Games Workshop selling you more and more and more, and bigger armies, bigger armies, bigger armies. We look at the scope of Warhammer 40K today, and it's not so much that they've added in other different vehicle classes. That's really kind of irrelevant, and we're going to take the giant War Titans out for a moment. The table is too small. The games are too big. And I know right now in 9th, on a side note, there's different levels to play. You can play bigger games, smaller games. They've kind of left it up to you. But the model creep in 40K has been pushed by Games Workshop because they want to sell models. That's it. The rules are just an excuse to get you to buy more. So what you see, if you look at a lot of Warhammer 40K pictures, the tables look a little too small. They're packed with too much stuff. It's almost like if you want to play at that level of game, you need to bring down the size of the models, the scale. Now that's, we're not going to do that. They're not going to do that because you don't want to have 2 different size scales. But that's what I'm illustrating. Now if we jump down to Chain of Command, historicals, kind of World War II, The scale there involves multiple units, maybe a company, or maybe looking at 4 or 5 squads, half a dozen vehicles, 10 vehicles. So to fit that on a standard wargaming table of Warhammer 40K size, that would be too big. So the scale is toned down. And then finally going to DBA, DBN Napoleonics, my Romans, I have 4 Roman soldiers on a base. That doesn't represent 4 Roman soldiers. That represents just whatever it is, kind of an abstract number. A fighting block, depends on the time period, depends on the number. So what we also see in scale is this idea, is it 1-to-1? I prefer to play 1-to-1, meaning if I have 10 Space Marines, each Space Marine represents what it is. If I have a Warhammer mech, look at that. That's the first mech that came to mind, but we're talking about Warhammer. So if I have a Warhammer Marauder, Battlemaster, and a Stinger, that's what they actually represent. If I have a King Tiger tank, that's what it represents. But when we get to large-scale battle games, and I mentioned Battle of Five Armies, if you look at that kind of classic War Master system, it's 3 or 4 figures on a base, but they're crowded together. Again, they represent 50, 25, 100, this fighting block. And then finally on the really, really high end, examples from my collection, Pacific Rim Extinction, a Jaeger or a Kaiju represents, it's a big model, it represents that fighting unit. It represents that fighting monster for what it is. I do prefer 1-to-1 scale, but I do realize if you're going really, really big historical major engagements before machines took over and it was literally manpower, thousands and thousands and thousands on an open battlefield, you need to go super, super small scale to make that work. Paint-wise, and this is just kind of a side note, then I'm going to open it up to you guys. The scale matters tremendously. It matters tremendously. When I had a Dark Angel army, so we're looking at Warhammer 40K scale, I've got, Tax, I've got some Raven Wing, I've got just kind of the classic Dark Angel. I like that look. I like that color presentation. When I started my first real battle tech, battle mech mercenary company, I wanted to kind of replicate that Dark Angel look in that format. The scale is a little smaller for the machines and on Battletech compared to Warhammer 40K. So it was interesting. It's the same paint, even the same primer, same technique. Because the Battletech scale is a little smaller, it looks a little darker than miniatures. It doesn't pop as much. So what I've found in terms of painting, and this is true for board gaming systems, that's a separate note. We're seeing board gaming systems release more and more bit. Now it's not just like you need 100 miniatures. Now they have to be giant-sized, oversized, mega-sized. The smaller the model scale, it's almost like the lighter the colors need to be. Even if it's not overly historic, some will say this kind of like a cartoon style. But even painting my late war Germans, I had to paint them lighter. The wood stock, the leathers, the camo, it was like 1 or 2 scales up from the historical, because I noticed early on, and learning from Battletech, you go smaller, it needs to be brighter. You go larger, things could be too bright. Like, why is that Land Raider like super, super yellow? You actually need to tone it down a little bit. So I think also scale plays into presentation, but that's a topic for, that's a different hobby paint type topic. And there's other channels on YouTube that covers that amazing. But I try to get 1-to-1. I like to play 1-to-1. But the biggest thing for me in the presentation is, what is the scale that the game wants to play in? And does it match up with the size of the engagement that they're presenting? If it does, it looks hot on the table. It looks like this is a game I want to play. I want to jump in. This looks amazing. If the scale is off, too big or too small for the engagement, it makes the table look too crowded or too barren with how it plays.